I'm delighted to introduce Manoel Horta Ribeiro, who is visiting us from EPFL. Manoel uses computational methods and causal inference to answer questions about social media policies, content moderation, recommendation algorithms, and so on. The effect of social media on society is a topic where there are lots of strong opinions, not enough evidence. And so Manoel's research has already had a big practical impact on companies, and is also, I think, very useful for policymakers and regulators. His research is prolific. Just last week, I think, he had a paper in PNAS, and his papers have won many Best Paper awards. He's won teaching awards. He's been on the Forbes 30 under 30 for science and healthcare, and the media has also extensively covered his work. So we're very lucky to hear from him today. For folks on the webinar, I just wanted to quickly mention that we won't be able to take Q&A through the webinar, but thank you for joining us. I know that the talk announcement says 4:30 to 6, but it's going to be a regular 50-minute talk, roughly, and time for questions at the end. Welcome again, everyone, and over to you, Manoel.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Manoel, and today I'm going to talk about online platforms like YouTube, Facebook, or Amazon, or Tinder, you name it, right? These platforms are central to our lives and the way that they moderate, recommend, monetize content, mediate their benefits and their harms. And today I'm going to talk about research that can hopefully improve these online platforms and by extension, improve society. But before going there, I want to take a step back and ask you all to imagine for a couple of seconds what would happen if all these platforms just disappeared. It would disrupt our economies, right? I mean, we buy stuff on Amazon all the time, we watch movies on Netflix, we order food on Uber Eats, and not to mention that it would eliminate communities that mean a lot to a lot of people, right? Many of us as researchers wouldn't be able to keep up to date with the latest papers on Twitter or X or Blue Sky or Mastodon, and not to mention the countless subreddits and Facebook groups dedicated to interests that go from hiking to gardening. And imagine how hard it would be to learn anything, right? Bayesian statistics, or how to remove oil stains from clothes, or who won the World Cup in 1994. All of that without Wikipedia or YouTube or Coursera. It's tricky, right? And I could go on and on here, but the point is that these platforms are deeply embroidered in the social fabric. And in that context, it's not surprising that these platforms are also deeply connected to some of the greatest challenges of the 21st century. Social media, for example, has been tightly linked to online radicalization, right? In this 2019 paper, for example, we showed that many users went from consuming contrarian influencers on YouTube to explicitly white supremacist content. And I guess we're all well aware that radicalization is not the only concern here, right? These platforms, they may negatively influence our mental health or information access. But online platforms are not immovable rocks that we should accept as they are. They're social technical systems that can be tweaked and adjusted. And as a society, we should try to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms of these systems. And throughout my doctorate, I advanced towards this goal through research that aims to understand the causal effect of content creation practices. And let me unpack that because there are two key concepts here. And the first one is curation practices. And this is really an umbrella term for what platforms mostly do. They curate, right? Users on these platforms create images, profiles, they tweet, and platforms curate this content and serve it to other users on this platform. And there's some key ways in which platforms curate. They decide what to recommend to users. They decide what content to keep and what content to remove. And they decide who gets to make money out of content within the platforms. And an important point here is that these things are actionable, right? If we understand how curation practices shape online platforms, we can improve them. Content moderation systems can be tweaked. monetization and moderation policies can be adjusted. And throughout my doctorate, my research on this has been published in CS journals, in CS conferences and general interest journals in collaboration with industry and other academic institutions, like this one's shown in the slide. But most important, has had real-world impact. It has shaped the public debate, appearing in over 100 news pieces from El País to NBC News, and in reports by think tanks, and has informed products in companies like Meta and Reddit. But let's get back to understanding the causal effect of content creation practices. Because to understand how research like my own can improve online platforms, we need a second concept, which is causality. Right? You see, descriptive work delineates correlations, and this is crucial because we must understand what the work is like. Right? So this is what we did in that 2019 paper. Right? We said, okay, what's going on in YouTube, right? But to truly improve online platforms, I'll argue that we need also to go one step further. We need to ask, what if, right? We need to ask, what would change if we intervened, if we flipped some switch? And for example, in more recent work that is just out there, we answered a related question that goes into this what if direction. If we follow the YouTube algorithm blindly, do we consume more or less radical content? And here, for example, we found evidence that the answer is no, we do not consume more radical content, right? But the point here is that to truly improve online platforms, we must also be able to imagine how things would be if we intervene, right? So we must sometimes go beyond description. And okay, so now that I set my menu, my agenda, let me walk you through today's menu, right? So hopefully the appetizer was tasty enough, and I was able to convince you all that you should care about content creation on platforms. And next, I'm going to talk about one of the key ways in which platforms curate content, which is content moderation. First, I'm going to talk about moderating comments on Facebook. Then I'm going to talk about the platform view. And I'm going to close things off with my vision for future work. And what I hope to get across here, besides the projects themselves, is my research style. So I like to have an impact. I like to tackle real-world issues and provide actionable insights. And I've often accomplished that by collaborating broadly, both across industry and academia. And I like to draw causal conclusions, and I've often done so by finding natural experiments and finding ways to draw causal conclusions from large, messy observation data. So let me give a concrete example that puts everything we talked about in practice. One of the biggest challenges of online platforms is the proliferation of harmful, mean, toxic content. This kind of content makes interacting less desirable platform and is also illegal in many countries. But the problem is that there's too much work for human moderators to detect and delete all this content. And therefore, platforms resort to automated systems. So for example, on Facebook, if you post a harmful comment, it's very likely that your comment will get deleted. And if you do so again and again, your account might be restricted or even banned. And back in 2021, I was awarded a fellowship at Facebook, and I went on to become an intern and a contractor there. And one thing that struck me is that they did not have a good answer to a very fundamental question, which is, do these systems work? Do they actually make users behave better in the real world? And you can say that maybe this is something trivial, right? You could run a randomized controlled experiment here. Imagine every time a system classifies a comment as harmful, you could simply flip a coin and say, okay, do I delete this comment or not? And then you could compare outcomes and contrast the subsequent behavior of users whose comments were deleted with users whose comments were not deleted. But what I came to realize working in Facebook is that running such a randomized experiment is actually super difficult. First, because you would be abstaining from removing harmful comments in the control group, which is questionable. but also because people really hate making this kind of experiment. So whenever it comes out that a company ran such an experiment, there's huge public coverage, which is a subject on its own, whether this is fair or not, but it is what it is, right? So what should we do? Should we give up? I mean, I wouldn't waste so much time of my talk if I had given up, but I would argue that we shouldn't, right? Because most of the data that in big data is not this data collected for experimental purposes. It's this messy data, this found data that basically originates from the world taking its messy course. So let's assume that we cannot run a randomized experiment, and let's see what would happen if we did a naive thing, and if we looked at correlation. We could simply compare users that had their comments deleted to users who didn't, right? And what would go wrong here? And here the problem really is that maybe we're not measuring the difference between auto-deleted comments versus non-auto-deleted comments, but that we're measuring the difference between these two very different groups of users. So this won't cut it, right? And here's the cool thing about doing this kind of thing. You often have to find ways to approximate an experiment with the data that you have at hand. That's not something that you can see easily, often. It's something that it requires some sort of like context-specific thing on the data, and it gives you this aha moment once you realize it. So let me see if I can share some of my aha moment with you all. And to that, let's look at how Facebook actually decides when to delete a comment. They do so with a machine learning classifier that scores each comment on a scale from 0 to 1. And they set this arbitrary, to some extent, threshold, right? This relates often to the precision and the recall of the classifier, such that comments that are scored above this threshold are deleted, and comments that are scored below this threshold are not. And so far, we gain nothing, right? Like I'm just explaining how this process works, but we still have the same invalid correlation study. But there's something neat here. If we focus around the threshold, we have the decisions are taken essentially at random. Comments that are scored just above or just below the classifier are essentially the same with regards to harmfulness, but they receive very different treatments. Those above are deleted, and those below are not. So as long as we focus around the threshold, we have something very close to a real experiment. We have a natural experiment, essentially for free. Okay, so now that we got the gist of it, I must confess that there's a small lie in what I say. Apologize. So it's not true that this decision is taken completely deterministically, okay? There's some fuzziness to it, and let me explain. In reality, there's not a single threshold that governs all deletions in a complex company like this. There's a bunch of classifiers and processes. So in this plot, I'm showing the score S on the x-axis and the probability of deletion on the y-axis. And you can imagine that if this was deterministic, this would look like a step function. It would be 0 before the threshold and 1 after the threshold. But it turns out that when the score is smaller than the threshold, there can be other mechanisms that can delete the comment, right? So there's other classifiers. There's a whole zoo of classifiers with Facebook deleting stuff. And to my surprise, because I didn't expect that, once a comment is above the threshold, there's actually things that can prevent a comment from being deleted. And for example, on Facebook, there were classifiers designed specifically to fish out comments, you know, that were considered harmless. So, for instance, like a lot of football-related things or soccer. Yeah. Okay. So, but still, there is this discontinuity, right? And comments that receive scores just below the threshold are given very different treatment than comments that receive scores just after the threshold. And we can still explore that as a sort of a natural experiment. And we can do that with a methodology called fuzzy regression scrutiny. And to do that, we need two ingredients. And the first one is what I just talked about, is this jump in the probability of treatment, right? And here, I can write that as this simple equation, right? So is the expected value of x, which is this binary variable, which equals to 1 whenever the comment gets deleted, right after minus right before the threshold. And the second ingredient that we need is some sort of outcome that we care about, right? So let's just say that day 0 is the day when we deleted the comment and we establish some follow-up period, let's say 28 days after. We can use this period to calculate an outcome that we care about, right? So we could look, for instance, at the number of subsequently deleted comments in this follow-up period, not counting day 0, not counting the original comment that was deleted, right? And I could show the same outcome in a very similar plot, right? So here on the x-axis, I have the score, and on the y-axis, I have this outcome that we discussed. And you can see that before the threshold, this is moving smoothly, and after the threshold, this is moving somewhat smoothly. But then there's this big decrease around the threshold. And this relates to the intervention, right? Because this is what changed right at that point. And the second thing we need is this decrease there. And the big insight of fuzzy regression discontinuity is that if we divide these two gaps, we get an estimate of the causal effect. Or more specifically, we get an estimate of the local average treatment effect at the cutoff, which qualifies the kind of treatment effect that you get. In practice, you can estimate that with a method called two-station squares, which economists might be overly familiar with. But in this case, essentially, this entails, the gist of it is that you have these models, these two linear models. One of them models y as a function of the score, which y is the outcome. The other one models the treatment as a function of the score. Each of these models has a baseline and a trend, and has a coefficient that's associated with this dummy variable. And this dummy variable is basically equals to 1 only after the threshold. So you can estimate that, and when you get the ratio between these two coefficients, you essentially get the causal effect, right? So there's some gory estimation details that I'm leaving aside, but we have a sound way to estimate the causal effect. And I used this study design to analyze almost 500 million comments on Facebook that were posted between June and August 2022. And specifically, we measured the effect of the violence and incitement classifier, which is one of many used within Facebook. And we considered two outcomes. The first one was the number of comments in the follow-up period. And the second one was what I talked about before, the number of deleted comments in the follow-up period. And we found very clearly that when you look at the engagement, at the number of subsequent comments, deletion has this temporary decreases in engagement. So here on the x-axis, I'm showing the different follow-up periods, and on the y-axis, I'm showing the standardized effect. But once we consider longer follow-up periods, we see that treatment and control groups are essentially the same, right? So there's no long-term decrease in engagement. But right after individuals get their comments deleted, there is some decrease. But when we look at the number of subsequently deleted comments, we see that there's a significant decrease across longer follow-up periods. Right? So it seems that people are less likely to break the rules here. And in the paper, which was published in on www, we also looked at a different scenario, which was this thread level scenario, where essentially we looked at what happens once you delete a comment to other users that are posting on the same thread. And there we found evidence of contagion. So the fact that you delete a comment not only prevents you from breaking the rules in the future, but it prevents other people that are in that same context from breaking the rules, right? For example, because it can prevent like a keyboard fight from starting, right? So we won't argue with someone because the comment of that person is not deleted. So in a nutshell, auto-deletions work. And this paper is, in my opinion, a good example of the potential impact of research on content curation. First, because we established this new way that we can use to evaluate content moderation. We found an experiment, which is a kind of like a research, something that could be used for other platforms. But second, because this work has had real impact inside of Mac, right? Before, all these content moderation teams cared about was like, what's the precision of my classifier? What's the recall of my classifier? But after that, they really started considering this second order effects, if you will, like how these classifiers shape user behavior within the platform. And beyond deletions, in other projects, I've also studied other content moderation practices, in particular around communities. Yes?
Yes. So this, I think, answers the question that someone inside Meta might have about, should I delete a comment that has a score around pressure or not, right? But if I'm a policymaker, I might want this to another question. For example, should the threshold be higher or lower? So how might your results of designs to that question, or would it actually require actual experiments to be run, or is there something about sort of the production process or the models we were using for this?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question just in case like there's recording things. But basically the question is like, what does this tell us about deleting comments at other thresholds, or what does this tell us about where the threshold should be, right? And so that's like when we talk about the LaTeX, the treatment effect at the cutoff, we really have this strong restriction that our estimate is at the cutoff, right? So we're not estimating the effect if the threshold was at 0.2, right? So that's important. One thing that they actually did after this work inside of Facebook is that they wiggle the threshold, right? So one thing that you can actually do to reason better about which threshold should you use is that you can actually wiggle the threshold and see if there's some effect when you set the threshold slightly lower or slightly higher. So especially Facebook, they're a big fan of like doing things automatically with fancy Bayesian stuff. So this is one direction that you could argue, that you could say, hey, I want this now to be a part of some objective function, where essentially the user behavior is taken into account just as other aspects are taken into account, like the precision and the recall of my classifier, right? But indeed, that's a big challenge, and it's really like a fundamental problem that I don't think that there's any way around it, because essentially, even in an observational sense, you don't have something that's crucial for causal inference there. You don't have common support, because if your decision is like it's deterministic for the treated case, right? Like for the comment that you are deleting, they're either deleted or they're not deleted, right? So essentially, you cannot compare them, right? So one thing that you could do there, but again, that's a bit hazy, is that you could have some sort of stochasticity, and say, okay, there's some chance, like my probability of deletion, sometimes I leave some comments not deleted, and I see what happens in these cases, and then you could get a better sense of it. But that's like the cutoff is a fundamental limitation of the methodology in that sense, that you can't really get around it, because it's you never deleted something that was slightly above the threshold for that reason.
Can you ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
When you consider the question of where the cutoff should be, it seems like there's a more fundamental issue, which is that false positives have a very different kind of cost from false negatives. So in one case, if you're deleting a comment that shouldn't be deleted, it's more of a free expression or free speech issue. And in the other case, you're leaving up some harassment or segments of violence that might have some concrete cost. And that's, I don't know, it just seems like that's not a quantitative question. It's more of a moral question. I was wondering if quantitative methods really have any applicability there, or how should we go about making those kinds of decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that also, I think in some sense, to get this into account, you need to really reason about the precision and recall classifiers, right? Which is the other components that there is to it. And in everywhere, like this classifier, they range from pretty okay for English speakers to terrible to like open source languages. So I think that this question becomes even more salient the lower resource you go in terms of like the resources available for NLP tests. So it's really important, and to some extent, you know, I think that these are taken, like from my internal experience, it's like this track code is really arbitrary to some extent, you know, it's really like some sort of CSV file that people push like diffs to, you know, rather than something that you know, like there's this structured sense. So it's definitely something that could be better explored.
Sorry, to push on what Arvin's saying though about measurement here, right? You sort of the story you're saying is that the measure you have of the negative consequences of, or the negative future posts that are going down is connected to the measure you have in the first place, right? Of what is innocent problematic. So it's like, is the results you get consistent with a world where what people are doing is not writing less text and content, but they are learning to evade deflate?
Yeah, so that's a big problem in general for this kind of design. And the way you try to see if this is not happening is by basically checking for the distribution, you know. So if what you said was like one of the sanity checks you have to do in this kind of study is to basically see if there isn't some bump right below the threshold, right? Because in the case where I'm trying to cheat, it means that I can manipulate my score for it to be right before the threshold, you know. So it's a bit like you can't, you know, like imagine tax declarations or something where there's a sharp threshold where once you cross this threshold, you're disadvantaged in some way. You would expect that there's this bump in the distribution. So the way we check for that is that we do some smoothness tests around the threshold. And this suggests that people are not like manipulating their scores to be right before the threshold, which does not completely address your comment about us using this imperfect classifier as the outcome, right? So it does not completely address that, but for English, which is the language we consider, it's pretty good because they have like these classifiers for content, for rule breaking content are really good because they have a lot of people working on continuously updating them, and they have a very specific pipeline. So we assume that this works. But regarding this manipulation of the pipeline, I think you can find evidence on the data that this is not the case because it's smooth, you know, like around the threshold. And if people were manipulating to be right before the threshold while still writing something offensive, you would expect that there's this little bump there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I know, right, it's that sorting is definitely like a flexible problem in general. I'm not sure I would see this as necessarily a sorting problem, but I guess it sort of turns on how much you think when people strategically try not to get censored, how much they are manipulating what they said, right? So I think your story is like they're changing it very slightly on the margin, and so it's only bumping the classifier a little bit. And I think my thing is more like there's some individual word that's like actually causing the classifier number to jump quite a bit, but intrinsically your running variable is like is the exact same measurement device as the outcome, just applied to a different set of text. Which is like one of these things where it's like it strikes me as like very like technically valid, but then on the like what does it correspond to in a measurement sense, it gets easier for me.
It's worth noting though that once we look at the outcome, you know, this is one specific way in which comments can get deleted. And this is a whole set of ways in which comments get deleted. Right. So violence and incitement accounts for, like, if I remember correctly, around 20% of the reasons why comments get deleted. So there's actually many other reasons why your comment can get deleted that are not because you got the threshold about this. If that makes sense. Any more questions on this side?
Can you talk a little bit about the equation that leads to that number between 0 and 1? And going back to this question a little bit, do you think that like if certain language has heavier weight in that equation, could certain like degrees of scrutiny and policymaking correspond with those? And so it's easier to declare a new arbitrary threshold as opposed to like having to create new experiments for that?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer that. I'm not sure if it will go right there, but basically, like, I think that one thing that's important to note is that this design of using machine learning classifiers, it's as this gap is kind of nice because you're not operating on this word level necessarily, right? This is BERT-like models that are used, and therefore you have this like super high dimensional space where if you train the same model twice with slightly different seed, you get a vastly different like decision boundary. So it's like the word example, the adversarial example, I think it's really clear, but I don't know to which extent it is true, right? And then the second, so that corresponds to the first half of the question. The second half of the question, if I understand correctly, is it's about like which extent can something that we do with this equation at the cutoff inform policymakers, right? And here I think it's really there's like a optimistic view and like negative view, right? The optimistic view is like this is the most important point for the policymakers because this is the threshold that Facebook actually uses, right? So they're actually using this threshold, not any other threshold, and you care about what Facebook actually does, right? On the other hand, it doesn't tell you about the counterfactual world where Facebook used a different threshold, right? So it can inform you as in what is the effect of the current policy, but it cannot inform you as what would be the difference had Facebook taken a different cutoff, right? So that's kind of like the good and the bad.
I guess this study focuses on organic content. I was wondering if you had a sense of how this translates to sponsored content, like ads or political ads or job ads or public ads, because there's some content moderation which happens there. And I think there's been studies from the my point group at NYU where there's like over 55% of ads, political ads or policy classifiers, political ads. Yeah, I was just curious if you had a sense of how these findings might translate.
I mean, my sense is that this overall pipeline of having classifier threshold decision is very widespread. So it would apply very closely to ads in the sense that the way that they classify political ads is exactly like this, right? Like you have a threshold, they have a classifier, they say, okay, this is a not, this is it, right? Because it's really hard to like, it's really hard to have any other way of doing that if you want some sort of like fancy NLP model or like multi-model. I think it would apply. So I'll move on. Yeah, so beyond like deletions, right? Other work I've done has focused on community level interventions. And for example, also on Facebook, we looked at this feature called post approvals, where the idea is that each and every post in a group, sometimes huge groups, gets approved by a moderator before it lands on the group feeds. And we found that, like, for instance, this practice has shaped groups for the better in the view of the moderators. It creates these groups focused on fewer, higher quality posts. And a lot of work has been done to make this easier because this is like used to be super labor intensive within Facebook. Moderators would literally have shifts where like they would, like, oh, today 10 to 11, my turn to approve posts, and they have this huge team of moderators doing so. More recently on Reddit, I was fortunate to help design a new intervention, right? So there we had this intervention called post guidance, which is just submitted to the conference, where the idea is to provide feedback to users as they write a comment, right, or a submission. So basically, as people are writing a submission, you can get a warning saying like, hey, your post doesn't conform to the rules. And these are something that the mods in the community can configure based on regexes. So it's something that really enables for personalized moderation for each community. And we ran this like large randomized experiment with over 30 subreddits and like thousands of users. And we found that this actually is pretty good because it increases the success of posts. So now people can post stuff and they don't get deleted by the auto moderator because they're able to quickly correct their mistakes. And it increases the perceived post quality. So posts that are created using this tool receives much more likes and upvotes on my data and so on. And overall, I think there's huge space for future work on this area, right? Because we know so little about the interventions that are used, and there's huge opportunities to design new interventions and to test these interventions. And perhaps you would say, hey, these are very small things, you know, like these interventions are consequential, but in aggregate, they shape online communities, right? I mean, we all had too much sushi one day or not, right? So, but at the same time, right, you have interventions where a single intervention is enough to shape online platforms. And that's the flavor of the second project I'm going to talk about, which is about the platforming. And the platforming is this umbrella term that has been used to refer to banning something, someone, a platform, a person, a community from social media. And there's this big complicated debate around whether and when it should be done, with proponents arguing that it may improve online spaces, and opponents arguing that it may not work, and that there's a lot of potential for censorship, right? And as a researcher, I think it's important that we know what it does to begin with, right? Like, what's the impact of this measure on social platforms? And before going there on how we study that, let me give you a crash course in platforming. So, and I'll use Parler as a case study because it's what I'm going to look at after. And it usually starts with some sort of event, right? And the event here was January 6th. This event increases attention towards the platform entity. For example, in this case, all eyes went to Parler because of the role it played during January 6th. And then caused both by the event and by the attention that the platform entity received, the entity's banned. So Parler was banned from the app stores, but most important from Amazon AWS, which hosted Parler, right? So the platform vanished from thin air. And again, the big question here is, does the platforming work? And let us be specific here and narrow down what we mean by work, right? And I'll focus on the case of Parler because for different platforms, work can mean different things. When we ban Parler, did people just move to other platforms where they consume very similar kinds of content, or do they change their behavior? And I'll call these platforms in general fringe platforms in opposition to mainstream platforms like YouTube or Facebook. And again, we could imagine a hypothetical randomized experiment here, but it's a bit absurd, right? But let's entertain the hypothesis, you know? Let's assume that everyone is hosted by Amazon AWS. Whenever there's some event that would lead to some platform being banned, Jeff Bezos himself flips a coin and decides, do we ban them or not, right? And then we compare outcomes for times when the platform was banned and the platform was not banned. So we just measure aggregate attention towards online platforms and we say, okay, it works or it doesn't work. And I guess I don't need to do a lot of convincing here that this does not work. And you can only imagine how happy regulators would be that we just flip coins and decide when to ban platforms, right? So again, we should not give up because these are important questions. And in this case, it's not that we don't want to run an experiment, but that we really can't, right? So let's see if we can find some neat way to extract some causal insights from observation data. And again, let's assume that we cannot run a randomized experiment, and let's see what would happen if we did the naive thing and looked at correlation. We could run this pre versus post study comparing overall attention towards fringe platforms before and after the whole thing happened. So before and after the platforming and the banning of and the January 6th happened, right? And the problem here is that it's unclear what we would be measuring, right? So maybe January 6th had this big positive effect on attention towards fringe platform, but the platforming had this negative effect. And when we sum these two things together, we wrongly assume that the platforming increased attention. So this won't cut it. And one way that we can try to see things and approximate an experiment, we can split this aggregate attention that I'm talking about in attention from different user types, right? So I'm just going to create three kinds of users. I'm going to create Parler users. These are users who prior to the whole thing consumed fringe platforms and mostly Parler. We can have fringe users, and these are users who prior to the whole thing consumed mostly other fringe platforms and not Parler. And we can have this third bucket, which is everyone else. Okay? And so far, again, we gain nothing, right? Like this is just a way to split the data. But there's something neat here again, right? If we look at these first two categories of users, we can actually approximate an experiment. We can run the pre versus post study on partner users and get some sort of delta. And these users experience both the platforming and the event. And we can do the same for fringe users. And importantly, these users did not really experience the platform, right? Because they did not use partner, right? So partner was the platform being the world where they were, but it's not like their platform vanished, right? So they only experienced the event. And we can get this orange delta. And the big insight here is that if we take the difference between these two deltas, or as the method is called, the difference in differences between these two deltas, we can actually get a measure of the causal effect. And this is under an important assumption that these things are somewhat additive, that in the absence of the platforming, these two groups would have progressed similarly, which is what we call parallel trends. So as long as we focus on these two kinds of users, right, we can actually approximate a real experiment here. Okay. And before I talk about the study or the results, let me just briefly discuss something that I've been taking for granted, which is this online attention, right? So in companies like Meta or Google, we often talk about things like daily active users or time spent, but not so much in academia. And to my great fortune, I came across Duncan and Homa, great collaborators who had access to data from the Nielsen company. Yes, Nielsen that does the TV ratings has gone into the business of tracking user behavior. And they have these very large panels where they basically track mobile and desktop consumption. Not only they have the full web history for these users, but they also have socioeconomic characteristics for their sample. And this data has several advantages when you compare it to other data that researchers usually have access to. First, it's cross-platform, which is much needed for the study at hand because we really care about what's happening across several platforms. And second, it tracks passive engagement, right? So when we look at things like tweets, these are often biased because some people tweet a lot, or the kind of people who tweet are very particular. But in this case, you don't have this problem associated because you have these socioeconomic characteristics, so you can correct for them, and so on. So that's this. So armed with the panel data and with the difference in differences methodology, we went on to study the effect of the platform in parallel on attention. We studied around 1,000 panelists, and this is a matched sample according to social economic characteristics. Half of this sample were parlor users, so they consumed mostly parlor prior to the platforming, and the other half were fringe users, which consumed mostly other kinds of free social media. And these are matched one-to-one so that they have similar socioeconomic characteristics and such that their consumption of fringe platforms in general were similar prior to the intervention. And we considered outcomes related to user attention. Specifically, we considered daily active use of Parler, of other free social media platforms, and of free social media platforms in general, which is really the two previous ones added up together. And I can show you one of these outcomes through time. So here we have the percentage of users active on other free social media across the treatment and control groups. And with this, we can basically use the month of December as our pre-intervention period. We can use the couple of weeks while Parler was shut down as the post-intervention period. We can calculate those deltas that we talked about, and we can estimate the causal effect. This is done with a slightly better way, right? We use sort of a linear model, but that's the gist of it, right? Okay, so what do we find once we estimate this causal effect, right? And here I'll split the results for users for whom we had desktop data and users for whom we had mobile data. And here we show that, and this maybe you could see it in the previous plot, but there's this increase in the consumption of other free social media by partner users, right? And this is both across both desktop and mobile panelists. At the same time, and that's not surprising, there's a decrease in the use of hardware because the social platform vanished. But what matters is what happened in aggregate, right? And in aggregate, we see that things remain more or less the same, right? So the daily active use of free social media in general is roughly the same across treatment and control groups once you take into account everything. And we didn't have it for all the panelists, but for some panelists we had time spent, which is another metric, right, that you can consider. And there we found essentially the same thing. So even when you consider the time these individuals spent on free social media, there was no difference after the platform. So in a nutshell, I mean, the platforming part did not work. So this is a negative finding, but I still think it's a good example of the potential implications of the potential for research on content creation, because it has this clear, sharp finding, right? If we ban just one of the free social media platforms, it doesn't seem to work. So if our rationale for banning this is that we want people to stop consuming this kind of content, we should not. Like, this is not an effective measure. And also, this opens the door for other studies on the platforming, because these panels are becoming more widely available in these years, so other people could do similar things.
The question about, one of the arguments for why deplatforming works or should happen is that you don't attract new users. So how would you try to measure whether newer users are coming into fringe media? As there is already, I mean, there's a view that, okay, the fringe people are going to be fringe, they're going to go find wherever they find, but new users are not attracted, therefore deplatforming is a good idea.
That's a good point. And in this case, we're like conditioning people that were on these platforms before. I think that, and this also resonates a bit with like next slide in a way, but basically, I think it matters a lot that you're already talking about fringe users here, right? Because maybe if you deplatform people from mainstream platforms, you have some sort of incidental attention that people are not like really looking for it, but that they're finding this kind of content. And I think the further you go to the fringe, like the further you go away from like mainstream content, where people actually have to take decisions to reach this kind of content, the least this matters, And the more you go to the mainstream, the more this matters. So definitely, I think that in other cases, and in this case, we can't really say much about fringe users. I can tell you about the aggregate attention, and that in aggregate, this basically doesn't seem to matter too much. And it's tricky as well, because platforming is not this like permanent measurement, because part of it was up, right? Like 1 week after. So it's really this thing that you cut at that moment where people are going. So it's also questionable whether, when you deplatform, does this actually translate to some long-term prevention of that?
Thank you. It's funny. It looks like all of us had a different understanding of what the point of deplatforming is supposed to be. So the way I had understood it is primarily as a punitive measure, which is that it tells these misbehaving apps that if they don't start enforcing content moderation, they're going to get kicked off and lose money and potentially have to shut down. I was curious what the takeaways are if you look at it from that perspective, and if there's any way to understand it could have any effects on that front.
I mean, but I feel that if it's always done after kind of like some terrible thing happened, you feel that it doesn't really work that way, right? Because it's not like they banned Parler, like it was like nothing changed inside of Parler before or after that, right? And so I don't know. And in terms of that, I think the counter argument that one could give is basically that, okay, now that these platforms like know that like people won't play along, they'll basically build their own infrastructure, right? So in a way, I think it's a bit of a miracle that these platforms have been so poorly managed. If you think about it. No, because like it's consistently like extremely bad, right? Like they always have these like bugs and like security issues and so on and so forth. So to some extent, you could make the argument that by doing that, you can actually create this like alternative ecosystem of hosting services of that really like would prevent you from doing any subsequent measures in the future.
Does that include alternatives to the app stores as well?
I mean, and yeah, the app stores are tricky because of Apple, right? Like it's a really big thing. But it would include mostly like hosting and DDoS prevention and these kind of things. But it's true that Apple is still like a huge monolith in that sense that I think that they can get through it, especially, yeah.
I also had a question about how you define the outcome. So like both of my colleagues had different views of the goal of deplatforming. The outcome you picked seemed to be largely driven by the data availability. So user activity on Fringe social media. And sometimes, you know, we just have to work with the data we have. And I'm wondering how you would think about what outcome or outcomes you're interested in if you have the possibility of other kinds of data.
Yeah, so I think that what would be very interesting is to get access to the actual content that people are consuming rather than the you know, like the time spent. And this is a limitation that comes because these platforms, like a lot of this content has been deleted and it has not been archived in any way. So ideally, I would say that like, you know, like if you had this, you know, like perfect snapshot of everything people did, what I would really like to see is like, okay, like what have people actually looked at? How has this changed? That. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the, you know, kind of positive fact that the motivation for the matching. Right. So one of the things is you have people who are identical in every dimension, except that half of them have elected to use Parler, and the other half of them have elected to use non-Parler fringe websites.
Yeah.
So they are, presumably this is not a random decision, right? And so I'm curious here what the advantage of the matching is, as opposed to saying Parler users and non-Parler users are different in that they use Parler or not Parler. And then how does that connect to the fact that Parler was the one that was removed, deplatformed, and the other ones were not?
Yeah, so we experimented with a couple of different ways of doing this, and if you run the regression without any matching, it actually outputs a very similar results. This is something that we did as robustness checks. But I think that the point here is that there's some sort of like demographic characteristics that are very specific towards some of these platforms. So Parler tends older than, for instance, 4chan. So one thing that we were afraid about was really this confounder of like saying, hey, like this event impacted these demographics very differently, and this is explaining the result. So this was the main reason why we wanted to control for that. We're saying like, you know, like maybe if you're like super young or if you're like on your 40s, you would react differently to that, or like, so I think that controlling for the demographics just prevents you from having a very different shock from the event that happened, which was January 6th, which might have impacted different demographics differently. Yeah, so that was the rationale that we had, because we at some point was like, okay, like these are essentially like, you know, like old people on Parler and like younger people on 4chan. So we had to flatten the curve to make them kind of like the same age and the same like socioeconomic level, so on.
So, I mean, the decision you could be studying the control direct effects, depending on whether you're trying to control for that mediator. If you think that age was determining what platform people are choosing to use, and by controlling for it, you're explicitly selecting a group that is not represented on each platform.
Yes.
Right? So there's some sense in which you've chosen people who are not, because the platform is distinct, you're creating this overlap, which makes that more likely that then they would be the ones to switch. Whereas if the world actually has created a situation where Parler is used by old people, other platforms are not, then perhaps they're not switching because they can't, and it depends really the estimate is.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Like in aggregate, when we ran the regression without like any controlling, we found very similar effect. So it was, I think, like 1 or 2 percentage points different for almost all the outcomes. But that's a good point. That when we do this, we actually change a bit. That's it. Yeah. Great. So I'll quickly mention that the platforming actually is like this umbrella term, and I think we need to study this thing separately, not as a single intervention. In other work, I studied like the platforming communities, like Arne Donald or influencers, and you get like different effects when, like, you know, for different things. So I think this is just adds to the fact that we actually need to run a bunch of studies of this, and it's not like because we ran one study, we know what's going on, because it's really complicated. And hopefully this gives a sense of how we can understand the causal effect of content creation. But the question you might all ask here is like, why should I do this in academia? Why should I just go to TikTok or YouTube to do this? And maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but essentially, these places have great experimenting infrastructure, and they have access to data, but fundamentally their incentives are not so well aligned, and they have been unable to tackle these challenges by themselves. At the same time, they lack some sort of systemic view that's often needed, like in this project, to really get to the answers that we care about. So I'd argue that we also need to do this kind of work in academia. And this is part of my future research agenda, because I think that there the issues are a bit flipped. What we lack to is access to data and experimentation. And as part of my future work, I want to have create infrastructure to study platforms. This entails finding new ways to get data, right? So can we recruit online panels? Can we find ways to get people to donate their data or sell their data? Or I've been working a bit with this Swiss NGO called Tournesol that does open source software to tweak recommendations on YouTube. And people are very willing to donate their data in many circumstances. And I think that this is a potential for a lot of that. It's a direction of a lot of potential. I also want to continue developing new ways of drawing causal conclusions from data, right? I think that's important, right? We're in the wake of this revolution and there's all these exciting things. And for instance, can we expand this classifier scenario where for scenarios where we do not know, like threshold, or we do not know the scores, right? Can we train our own classifiers looking at decisions that companies take, and can we use that to measure the causal effect of companies? And I would also like to continue to collaborate with industry, right? Like, I think that maybe there's new ways to collaborate with industry that would be very interesting. Europe is being shaken by the Digital Services Act, for example, when companies now have to set infrastructure to share data. And I hope this sparks a new era for collaborations between companies and academia. And another important direction I want to pursue is related to artificial intelligence. As new technologies like LLMs are developed and become popularized, I think this will deeply impact online platforms and also may enable new content creation practices and new ways to study online platforms. So, for instance, LLMs enable the creation of personalized interventions, right? Can we say to users what they did wrong when we delete their comments instead of simply deleting their comments? Or can we tailor messages to different users? They may also change how we study human behavior, right? So like there's this concept of silicon samples now where can we run experiments on LLM generated data rather than on real users, right? And one particular direction I'm interested here is around algorithmic audits, right? So for example, in deterministic audits like that Pinas paper, really, I'll go back to it very quickly. So we have this, for instance, real YouTube histories, right? And we instantiate these control bots, which simply watch the videos, and we instantiate these counterfactual bots, which watch the videos up to a certain point, and then, for instance, follow the algorithm. And we can get an estimate of the effect of the algorithm by comparing these two groups of bots. What if we have access to LLMs now, right? Can we change these user traces and really simulate these user traces using LLMs? Or could we study populations that we couldn't study otherwise, right? Like there's a lot of concern around the impact of social media on teenagers and kids. Can we simulate user traces for these populations? Or could we simulate interventions that would be unethical or hard to achieve, like exposing users to radical content, right? And see what happens. But besides these fun new directions, I think that there's also a lot of challenges that are coming up with generative AI. So for example, there's huge concern around AI-generated misinformation and disinformation. And I think it's important that we ground this into reality, right? Can we assess that? Can we assess what's the risk of that? Or is this just some like widespread concern that is unfounded, right? One first dip I did around that has to do with maybe not the first thing you would think about, which is crowdsourcing. And we estimated, for instance, that a very, very large fraction of crowd workers in platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk actually use LLMs for text-related tasks. And that's concerning, right? Because you have all the psychologists studying humans in Amazon Mechanical Turk or prolific. And I mean, I'm excited about silicon samples, but not that fast, you know, like it's slow. And for instance, I think this shows that everyone is concerned about this because you post these things on Twitter and like all the researchers are terrified, like, oh, what's going on and so on. So it is the case that we're all a bit afraid of like what's going to change once these LLMs become even more powerful and widely available. But there's so much more to explore here, right? How will these models shape social media now that you can swipe people off like images and, you know, and like, will it distort even or sense of reality even further? Will it change online reviews, right? Like now people writing reviews with ChatGPT and like how will this impact science? Will it change online marketplaces? I think that there's this fundamental shift in the rules of the game in online platforms because it has become very easy to produce content that often is and often looks like high quality and human. So I think we must understand what will be the negative consequences and which interventions can prevent these negative consequences. So I hope you all enjoyed today's menu. And if there's something that was too hard to chew, here you can find the tag for the takeaway. So my research can improve online platforms by understanding content creation practices using methods from causal inference, machine learning, network analysis. So everything I presented was only possible due to my amazing collaborators. Thank you very much. And I'd love to take any additional questions, either offline or
Let's take maybe one question since we're at 5:30 and then maybe continue the conversation more informally.
So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for giving like a sort of causal angle on this. I'm wondering if you could talk, one thing that didn't come up in the press segment of causal stuff is that all of these estimates are on the margin, right? So the thing that you care about in some sense is how the system changes, but all of these sort of things are designed to affect like if you change the treatment status for one unit, not if you change them all for a bunch of units and you get sort of broad interference. And so when you're doing your sort of policy focused work, how do you think about the sort of like interference, spillover, contagion sort of with large issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to me there seems to be some sort of progression there, right? Because to me this spillover question seems to come from like some sort of non-trivial consequence of the individual plannings, right? So in a sense, like I think the reality is that we study these things on the margin because this was the easiest thing to do. Like the other thing is really like impossible. But what I would assume is that to some extent there's some modeling work that should follow that in terms of saying, okay, how could these things scale? And how would we expect things to scale? And for some of the questions, I would expect that we would not be able to get questions about the answers about the spillover effects until something happens. You know, I don't think that there's an easy way out that we can create this model for the spillover and say, yeah, like this is probably how it's going to work. So in that sense, I think it's a mix between like if any policy advising should be a mix between the evidence that you have at hand and the spillover, the like some sort of prediction or some sort of common sense for the spillover, right? So for example, for the Potter paper, right? I think there, like really the spillover, the banning a lot of units seems to be something that's much more promising, right? From a theoretical perspective on robustness and on removing nodes from a complex network. So I would say that, for instance, the fact that the margin doesn't work suggests that we should go beyond that, for example. But I really think this is some sort of very context-specific question that we need to think about. What's the direction of the effect? What does this mean in this case? What's the consequence of the spillover likely to be like? So I think it's really like something that should be done in some sort of like case-by-case basis with the best information that's available. But I'm a bit skeptical that you can, you know, you can get like really, you can be really confident in saying something unless you can actually study some cases where it actually happened personally.
Great. Thank you again, Manuel.